The day I came home to find a handwritten note taped to my front door demanding I share my firewood with the neighborhood was the day I realized just how insane my homeowners association had become. I'm Victor Hendricks, a 42-year-old software engineer who made the mistake of buying a house in Pine Ridge Estates, Colorado, about 3 years ago. The development sat nestled in the foothills just outside Boulder, where winters hit hard and heating bills could bankrupt you if you weren't careful. When I moved in, the HOA seemed reasonable enough. Standard stuff about lawn maintenance, no bright pink houses, keep your trash cans hidden. Normal suburban restrictions that I could live with in exchange for a nice mountain view and good property values. But things changed about 18 months ago when Brenda Carmichael got elected as HOA president. Brenda was the textbook definition of a Karen, a 53-year-old woman with an asymmetrical blonde bob that somehow always looked freshly styled, oversized sunglasses permanently perched on her head, and an apparent addiction to meddling in everyone's business. She drove a white Lexus SUV with those stick-figure family decals on the back, except hers only showed her 3 cats and what I assumed was a wine glass. The note on my door was written in her distinctive loopy handwriting. Dear Victor, it has come to the HOA board's attention that you have accumulated a substantial firewood supply on your property. Given the community spirit of Pine Ridge Estates, we believe this resource should be shared among all residents who may need it during the upcoming winter months. Please contact me to arrange a distribution schedule. Regards, Brenda Carmichael, HOA President. I read it 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise a little higher. The firewood she was referring to wasn't just some casual stack I'd picked up at the grocery store. I'd spent the entire previous winter and most of the spring cutting, splitting, and stacking nearly 6 cords of wood. 6 cords. That's over 700 cubic feet of seasoned pine, spruce, and aspen that I'd personally harvested from my cousin's property up in Estes Park after he'd had some trees taken down. Every weekend for months, I'd driven up there with my truck, loaded it with logs, brought them back, split them by hand with a maul, and carefully stacked them in my backyard to dry. My hands had calluses on top of calluses. I'd lost 10 pounds from the physical labor. I'd even bought a tarp and built a proper wood shed to keep it all dry and properly seasoned. This wasn't just firewood. This was the result of hundreds of hours of backbreaking work. I crumpled the note and walked inside, tossing my keys on the counter harder than necessary. My fireplace was one of the main reasons I'd bought this particular house. It was a beautiful stone hearth that heated the entire downstairs, and with natural gas prices climbing every year, I'd calculated that using wood as my primary heat source would save me close to $1,500 over the winter. That firewood represented both money saved and effort invested. My phone rang that evening around 7. Unknown local number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. Victor, this is Brenda Carmichael from the HOA. Her voice had that syrupy, sweet tone that people use when they're trying to sound friendly but are actually preparing to make demands. I got your note, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad. So we were thinking that Thursdays would work well for distribution. You could put out, say, a cord of wood in your front yard each week, and neighbors who need it could come by and take what they need. First come, first served, of course. I actually laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. Brenda, I'm not giving away my firewood. There was a pause. Excuse me. That's my personal property. I spent months gathering and processing that wood. It's for my own use. Victor. Her voice had changed, losing the sweetness. Pine Ridge Estates is a community. We believe in sharing resources and helping each other out. Some of our elderly residents are on fixed incomes and can't afford expensive heating bills. Then they can do what I did and gather their own wood, or they can call a firewood supplier. This is Colorado. There's no shortage of places to buy firewood. The HOA bylaws clearly state that residents must contribute to community welfare initiatives. Brenda, I've read the bylaws front to back. There's nothing in there about surrendering personal property. If there was, I never would have bought here. We'll be updating the bylaws at our next meeting, she said sharply. I suggest you attend. It's next Tuesday at 7 at the community center. She hung up before I could respond. I spent the weekend trying to forget about the whole thing, but Monday morning brought a new development. An official-looking letter appeared in my mailbox, this time on HOA letterhead. It informed me that the board had voted unanimously to implement a resource-sharing initiative, and that my firewood supply had been designated as a community resource subject to equitable distribution. I was given until the following Monday to comply or face daily fines of $200. This was absolutely insane. I immediately called my real estate lawyer, Tom Patterson, who I'd used when buying the house. After I explained the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. Victor, they can't legally do this. Your firewood is your personal property. They'd have an easier time demanding you hand over your car or your furniture. But fighting the HOA will cost you money in legal fees, and they know it. They're counting on you either complying or selling and moving. What about the fines? Technically, they can fine you according to their bylaws, but only for legitimate violations. This isn't legitimate. They can't create bylaws that violate property rights. However, they can make your life difficult. They can put a lien on your property if fines accumulate. You'd have to sue to get it removed, which costs money. So what do? Attend the meeting tomorrow. Bring witnesses. Record it if Colorado's a one-party consent state for recording, which it is. Document everything. And if you want to fight this, I'll back you up, but it won't be cheap or quick. I thanked him and hung up, already feeling the stress tension building in my shoulders. Tuesday evening, I drove to the Pine Ridge Community Center with my phone ready to record. The meeting room was more crowded than usual, probably about 30 residents instead of the typical dozen who showed up to these things. Brenda sat at the front table with the other board members. Dale Morrison, a retired accountant who seemed to just nod at whatever Brenda said. Patricia Vance, a nervous woman in her 60s who always looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. And Richard Tang, a younger guy who'd moved in about a year ago and apparently saw HOA board membership as a stepping stone to local politics. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her agenda. First item of business, the Resource Sharing Initiative. We're here to formalize the policy that certain accumulated resources within the community should be shared for the common good. I raised my hand. Point of order. We should be discussing whether such an initiative is even legal before we formalize anything. Brenda's expression soured. Victor, I'm sure you're upset about the firewood situation, but this is bigger than your personal feelings. It's not about feelings. It's about property rights. You can't just declare someone's personal property a community resource. An older man I recognized as George from 3 streets over spoke up. I think Brenda has a point. We're a community. If Victor has more than he needs, why shouldn't he share? Because I don't have more than I need, I countered. I have exactly what I need to heat my house all winter, and even if I had extra, it's my right to decide what to do with my own property. A woman named Susan chimed in. But some of us can't physically cut wood. I'm 67 years old. How am I supposed to do what you did? You can buy firewood from any number of suppliers, I said. I'm not running a charity. I worked hard for that wood. Brenda cut in. This is exactly the selfish attitude we're trying to discourage in Pine Ridge. We're putting it to a vote. All in favor of the resource-sharing initiative. About 20 hands went up, mostly older residents who I realized probably wanted my firewood for themselves. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Motion carried, Brenda announced with a satisfied expression. Victor, you have until Monday to begin distribution or face the consequences. This is theft, I said clearly, making sure my phone was capturing everything. You're voting to steal my property. I'll be taking legal action. You'll be paying fines, Brenda shot back. $200 per day, until you comply. I walked out of that meeting knowing this was about to get much worse before it got better. Wednesday morning, I found the first sign posted in my yard. A handmade poster reading, "Free firewood, help yourself," with an arrow pointing to my backyard. I tore it down immediately and checked my security cameras. Brenda had planted it there herself at 6 in the morning. I saved the footage. Thursday brought a knock on my door. A sheriff's deputy stood on my porch, looking uncomfortable. Victor Hendricks. I've been asked to deliver this notice from the Pine Ridge Estates HOA regarding accumulated fines. I took the paper. $400, representing 2 days of fines. The letter stated the fines would continue daily, and that a lien would be placed on my property if they reached $5,000. Deputy, are you aware they're fining me for refusing to give away my personal property? I asked. He shifted his weight. Sir, I'm just here to deliver the notice. HOA disputes are civil matters. You need to take it up with a lawyer or the courts. After he left, I called Tom Patterson again. We discussed options and he confirmed what I already suspected. Fighting this properly would take months and cost thousands. The HOA had deeper pockets than I did because they could levy fees on every homeowner to fund legal battles. I'd be fighting alone. That evening, I sat in my living room staring at the fireplace and thinking. The firewood in my backyard represented a significant investment of time, effort, and money. It was mine. I'd earned it through my own labor. But Brenda and her mob of entitled neighbors had decided they were owed a piece of it simply because we lived in the same development. An idea started forming in my mind. A petty, spiteful, absolutely justified idea. If they wanted my firewood so badly, if they were going to fine me into submission or force me to distribute months of hard work to people who hadn't lifted a finger to help gather it, then I'd make sure nobody got it. Not me, not them, nobody. Friday after work, I stopped at a hardware store and bought supplies. A wheelbarrow, some accelerant, a few other items. When I got home, I checked the weather forecast. Clear skies expected through the weekend. Perfect. Saturday morning at dawn, I began moving firewood from the shed to my backyard fire pit. Trip after trip, I wheeled load after load of carefully seasoned, perfectly split wood to the large stone fire pit I'd built the previous summer. It was technically against HOA regulations to have fires that weren't contained in proper pits, but I'd built mine to code with proper ventilation and clearance from structures. It had been approved before Brenda took over. By noon, I'd moved about 2 cords of wood around the fire pit, stacking it carefully. Several neighbors had come out to watch, looking confused. Brenda appeared at my fence around 1 in the afternoon. "Victor, what are you doing?" "Having a fire," I said simply, continuing to stack wood. "That's an excessive amount of wood for a fire. It's my wood to burn. You said I should share it with the community, right? Well, everyone can enjoy the warmth of this fire. I'm being neighborly." Her face turned red. "You can't burn it all. That's wasteful and spiteful." "Actually, I can." It's my property, and I'm using it as I see fit. There's no HOA regulation against having a large bonfire as long as it's in a proper pit, and I notify the fire department, which I already did. They said it was fine as long as I keep it controlled. I'd actually called the Boulder County Fire Department that morning and explained I'd be having a large bonfire on my property. They'd asked about the pit specifications, confirmed I had a hose and extinguisher ready, and told me to enjoy myself. Legal burn season was open and I was well within my rights. Brenda sputtered. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child." "I'm acting like someone whose property rights are being violated. You want my wood, here it is. Everyone can enjoy it burning." She stormed off, pulling out her phone. I figured she was calling the other board members or possibly the fire department to complain. It didn't matter. I was committed now. By mid-afternoon, I'd arranged about 3 cords of wood around and in the fire pit, building a massive structure that would burn for hours once lit. More neighbors had gathered, some looking angry, others amused. A few people understood exactly what I was doing and why. George from down the street yelled over, "You're being selfish. Some of us need that wood." "Then you should have cut your own," I shouted back. "Nobody was stopping you. Instead, you voted to steal mine." We voted to share community resources. My private property isn't a community resource. Around 5 o'clock, with the fire structure complete, I went inside and grabbed a lighter and the grill starter I'd bought. I also grabbed a lawn chair and a cooler with some beer. If I was going to burn months of work, I might as well enjoy watching it. The fire started slowly, then caught in earnest as the kindling and smaller pieces ignited. Within 30 minutes, I had a roaring bonfire that radiated heat across my entire backyard and into the neighboring yards. The flames climbed 20 feet high at their peak, consuming the dry, seasoned wood with impressive efficiency. I sat in my chair, beer in hand, watching months of labor go up in smoke. It was cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. Yes, I was destroying something valuable, but I was doing it on my own terms, exercising my property rights in the most dramatic way possible. They couldn't find me for not sharing wood that no longer existed. Brenda returned with Dale and Richard in tow. They stood at my fence, staring at the massive fire. "You're insane," Brenda screamed over the roar of the flames. "Completely insane." "I'm not the one trying to steal my neighbor's property," I called back. "We'll increase your fines. We'll sue you." "For what?" "Burning my own wood on my own property with proper permits. Good luck." They argued with me for another 10 minutes before giving up and leaving. Other neighbors came and went throughout the evening. Some were angry, others seemed to grasp that I'd been pushed into this corner. A few people I'd barely spoken to before came by just to say they supported what I was doing. My next-door neighbor, Frank Martinez, brought over a chair and joined me around 9 that evening. "That's quite a statement you're making," he said, accepting a beer from my cooler. "They gave me no choice. Either give away months of work or pay fines until they put a lien on my house." Brenda's gotten out of control. Last month she tried to fine me for having a basketball hoop in my driveway, said it was an eyesore, a basketball hoop for my kids. "What happened?" I told her to kick rocks, but she's been watching my house looking for violations. She got me on a mailbox issue last week. The post had some rust, $50 fine. We sat in silence for a while, watching the fire consume another log. "I'm thinking of selling," Frank admitted. "This used to be a nice place to live. Now it feels like living under a dictator who's obsessed with property values and appearances." "Where would you go?" "My wife wants to move to Longmont. No HOA in the neighborhood we're looking at, just regular city ordinances, which are way more reasonable." The fire burned through the night. I stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, feeding it more wood whenever it started to die down. I wanted to make sure every piece I'd stacked was consumed. By the time I went to bed, I'd burned through about half of my entire supply. Sunday morning, I woke up early and started again. The fire pit still had hot coals, making it easy to restart the blaze. I spent the entire day hauling the remaining wood from my shed and feeding it to the fire. Neighbors gathered periodically to watch, some angry, some entertained, all of them talking about it. By Sunday evening, my woodshed was empty. 6 cords of firewood, hundreds of hours of work, thousands of dollars in heating value, all reduced to a massive pile of ash and coals in my backyard fire pit. I stood there with the hose, making sure every last ember was properly extinguished, feeling both triumphant and exhausted. Monday morning brought another visit from Brenda. She looked like she hadn't slept well. "The board is meeting tonight to discuss additional fines for your behavior this weekend," she announced from my driveway. "Fine me for what?" I asked. "I burned my own property legally on my own land with proper permits. I broke no laws and no legitimate HOA rules. You deliberately destroyed resources that could have helped the community. I exercised my property rights. You tried to force me to give away my personal property. I chose to use it myself instead. How I use my own property is my business. We'll find something," she threatened. "Your lawn is looking a little long. That's a violation right there." I looked at my lawn. It was perfectly fine, maybe 3 inches tall. The HOA rules stated grass couldn't exceed 4 inches. My lawn is in compliance and you know it. "You're just vindictive because I didn't roll over and let you steal from me." It wasn't stealing. It was community sharing. Community sharing would be asking politely if I had extra to share. You demanded it, threatened fines, and tried to force me. That's called extortion. She opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned and marched back to her car. Tom Patterson called me that afternoon. "Victor, I heard about your bonfire. The whole neighborhood is talking about it." "Good, let them talk." "The HOA is looking for ways to retaliate. I got a call from their lawyer this morning asking about legal options. I told them they didn't have any, that you acted within your rights, but they're not happy. Let them be unhappy. They tried to steal from me." I agree completely. But watch yourself. Brenda Carmichael strikes me as the type who doesn't let things go. Document everything, keep your cameras running, and don't give them any legitimate violations to hit you with. Over the next 2 weeks, life became a game of cat and mouse. Brenda and her board members started patrolling the neighborhood specifically to find violations at my property. They measured my grass with a ruler. They photographed my house from every angle looking for peeling paint or damaged trim. They documented the exact time I put my trash cans out and when I brought them back in. They managed to fine me twice. Once for bringing my trash cans in 4 hours late after trash day, which was technically a violation I'd just forgotten about. That cost me $25. The second time was for a small bush in my front yard that had grown slightly over the property line into the common area sidewalk. I'd trimmed it within hours of getting the notice, but the $50 fine stood. But they couldn't fine me for the firewood anymore because it didn't exist. That seemed to infuriate Brenda more than anything. She tried to force me to comply, and I'd responded by removing the entire point of contention. 3 weeks after the bonfire, Frank Martinez knocked on my door one evening. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, come in." We sat in my living room, and Frank looked uncomfortable. "Something happened today," he started. "I got pulled aside by Richard Tang. He said the board was willing to drop all the harassment against you if you'd apologize publicly for the bonfire and make a donation to the community fund." "Are they serious?" dead serious. He said Brenda feels disrespected and that your actions have undermined the authority of the HOA. They want a public apology at the next meeting and $500 to the community fund as a gesture of goodwill. I laughed. That's never happening. I did nothing wrong. I'm not apologizing for exercising my property rights, and I'm certainly not paying them for the privilege. That's what I figured you'd say. But there's more. Richard kind of hinted that if you don't make peace, they're going to make your life hell. He mentioned they're considering bringing in a lawyer to look for any possible way to force you out. I've got a lawyer too, and I've documented everything. They've been harassing me for weeks. I know. That's actually why I'm here. Frank pulled out his phone. I've been documenting stuff too. I'm not the only one. A lot of neighbors are getting sick of Brenda's power trips. There's talk of calling a special election to remove the board. This was news to me. Really? Yeah, it takes 20% of homeowners to petition for a special election according to the bylaws. We're almost there. The Firewood thing was bad enough, but the way she's been targeting you since then has pissed people off. Plus, she's started going after other people too. The Johnsons got fined for having the wrong shade of white on their front door. The Pratts got hit for parking their RV in their driveway for 2 days while they loaded it for a trip. It's getting ridiculous. What do you need from me? Just keep doing what you're doing. Don't give them any real violations. Document everything. And when we get enough signatures, be ready to testify at the special election meeting about what they did to you. I agreed, feeling a small spark of hope that this nightmare might actually end. The petition for a special election was submitted 4 weeks after my bonfire. Frank and a woman named Michelle Cooper, who lived 2 streets over, had collected signatures from 38 homeowners out of the 146 in Pine Ridge Estates. That was well over the required 20%. The existing board fought it, of course. Brenda sent out a mass email to all residents claiming the petition was invalid due to technicalities. But Tom Patterson reviewed it pro bono and confirmed it met all requirements under Colorado HOA law. The special election was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving time for candidates to declare and campaign. Brenda and her board could run again, and they did. But several new candidates emerged. Frank threw his hat in the ring, as did Michelle, George Wilson, who was a retired lawyer, and Karen Yates, a younger woman who worked in nonprofit management. A guy named Carl from the far end of the development also ran, though he seemed primarily motivated by wanting to eliminate all HOA fees rather than actually managing anything. The campaign was ugly. Brenda sent out multiple emails defending her board's actions, including a long screed about how certain selfish individuals were trying to undermine the community. She never mentioned my name specifically, but everyone knew she meant me. Frank, Michelle, and the other candidates took a different approach. They campaigned on transparency, reasonable enforcement of rules, and ending the harassment of homeowners. Frank specifically mentioned the Firewood incident in his campaign materials, framing it as an example of the board overstepping their authority. I helped where I could, hosting a meet and greet at my house for the reform candidates, and making sure people saw the documentation I'd kept of Brenda's harassment. The photos, the videos from the HOA meeting, the timeline of escalating fines and violations, all of it painted a clear picture of retaliation and abuse of power. The night before the election, Brenda made a critical mistake. She sent out an email that crossed the line from aggressive campaigning into outright defamation. She wrote that I was a danger to the community, and that my unstable behavior and disregard for community standards made me unfit to live in Pine Ridge Estates. She implied I'd made threats against board members and suggested residents should be cautious around me. None of it was true. I forwarded the email to Tom Patterson immediately. "That's textbook defamation," he said after reading it. "She's accusing you of being dangerous and making threats without any evidence. We can sue for this." "Will it be expensive?" "Not as expensive as some cases. This is pretty clear-cut. And honestly, I'll do it for a reduced rate because I'm sick of abusive HOA boards getting away with this stuff." The special election was held on a Saturday afternoon at the community center. Turnout was massive. Over 100 homeowners showed up to vote. The ballot had 5 board seats, and voters could choose up to 5 candidates. When the results were announced that evening, Brenda's entire board had been swept out. Frank Martinez came in first place with 92 votes. Michelle Cooper was second with 88. George Wilson, Karen Yates, and surprisingly Carl, the anti-HOA fee guy, rounded out the new board. Brenda received only 34 votes. Dale got 29. Patricia and Richard both dropped out before the election, apparently seeing the writing on the wall. Brenda's face when the results were announced was something I'd remember forever. Pure shock mixed with fury and disbelief. She genuinely thought she'd win, that her fear-mongering and smear campaigns would work. Instead, the community had rejected her completely. The new board was sworn in immediately, as per the bylaws. Their first act was to review all outstanding fines and violations. They dismissed every fine I'd received except the 2 I'd legitimately earned for the trash cans and the bush. They also dismissed about 24 fines against other homeowners that had been issued for petty or questionable violations. Their second act was to formally rescind the resource sharing initiative, declaring it had been implemented without proper legal review and violated homeowner property rights. Frank approached me after the meeting. "We did it," he said, shaking my hand. "You did it," I corrected. I just provided a dramatic example of why change was needed. That bonfire probably saved the neighborhood. It woke people up to how bad things had gotten. The week after the election, I filed the defamation lawsuit against Brenda personally with Tom Patterson's help. The email she'd sent was clear evidence, and we had dozens of witnesses who'd received it. We weren't seeking a huge amount, just $20,000 in damages and a formal retraction and apology. Brenda tried to claim HOA immunity, arguing she'd sent the email in her capacity as board president. But since she'd sent it after the election was called and she was no longer president, and since it was a personal attack rather than official HOA business, the judge ruled against her motion to dismiss. The discovery phase was enlightening. We subpoenaed HOA records and found that Brenda had been even more aggressive than I'd realized. There were records of her attempting to fine people for things that weren't even violations. She tried to assess special fees without proper board votes. She'd even used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, claiming they were administrative costs. That last part caught the attention of the new board. Frank called an emergency meeting and brought in an accountant to review the books. They found over $8,000 in questionable expenses over the 18 months Brenda had been president. Personal lunches she'd claimed were board meetings. Office supplies that were actually decorations for her house. Even a weekend trip to a conference in Vegas that had no connection to HOA management. The new board voted unanimously to file a civil suit against Brenda for embezzlement and misuse of HOA funds. They also filed a report with the Boulder County District Attorney's Office. Things escalated quickly after that. The DA took the case seriously because HOA embezzlement was becoming a problem across Colorado. They launched an investigation, subpoenaed records, and interviewed multiple homeowners about Brenda's conduct. 3 months after the special election, Brenda Carmichael was arrested at her home and charged with embezzlement, theft, and misconduct in office. The charges covered not just the HOA funds, but also additional evidence that she'd been collecting fines in some cases and pocketing the money, rather than depositing it into the HOA account. The arrest made the local news. Former HOA president arrested for embezzlement ran in the Boulder Daily Camera. The story detailed the charges and mentioned the contentious Firewood incident that had sparked the investigation into her conduct. My defamation suit settled before trial. Brenda's lawyer advised her to accept our terms rather than risk a jury trial given everything else happening. She paid $15,000 in damages, issued a public written apology that was sent to all Pine Ridge residents, and agreed never to serve on the HOA board again. The criminal case took longer. Brenda initially pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. The DA had paper trails, witness testimony, and even some text messages where Brenda had discussed with Dale Morrison how to maximize fine collection from residents she considered troublemakers. Dale ended up flipping on Brenda, testifying that she'd pressured him to go along with questionable financial decisions. He received immunity in exchange for his testimony. 8 months after her arrest, Brenda accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and theft charges. The judge sentenced her to 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, full restitution of the embezzled funds plus interest, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. She also had to pay a $10,000 fine to the state. Standing in that courtroom watching the sentence handed down felt like justice finally being served. The new HOA board, meanwhile, transformed Pine Ridge estates. Frank and his team rewrote significant portions of the bylaws, adding protections for homeowner rights and limiting the board's authority to impose fines without clear violations. They implemented a formal appeals process for any homeowner who disagreed with a fine or violation notice. They required quarterly financial reports to be distributed to all homeowners with full transparency on expenses. Most importantly, they changed the culture. The HOA went from being an adversarial force that looked for violations to a genuine community organization that focused on maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events. As for me, I spent the following winter burning natural gas like everyone else since I destroyed my firewood supply. It cost me more, but I considered it money well spent. I'd made a point. I'd stood up for my property rights. And I'd sparked a change that improved life for everyone in the neighborhood. The next spring, my cousin called me up. "Hey, I'm having more trees taken down. You want the wood?" I thought about it for a long moment. The new board would never try to steal firewood. Frank had actually apologized on behalf of the HOA for what the previous board had attempted. But still, the memory of that fight was fresh. "You know what? Yeah, I'll take it, but this time I'm building a locked shed." Frank laughed when I told him about my plans for a new, secure wood storage shed. "You don't need to lock it up. Those days are over." "Better safe than sorry," I said. I spent that summer once again cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking firewood. This time, though, neighbors would stop by and chat while I worked. A few asked if I'd help them learn how to process firewood themselves. I spent several weekends teaching interested neighbors how to split wood properly, what to look for in good burning wood, and how to stack and season it correctly. By the next winter, 4 other houses in Pine Ridge had their own firewood supplies. Not because anyone was forcing them to gather their own, but because I'd shown them it was possible and worthwhile. George from down the street, who'd yelled at me during the bonfire, actually apologized one day. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I bought into Brenda's rhetoric about community sharing. But you were right. It was your property. I had no right to vote to take it from you." "I appreciate that," I told him. "And if you ever actually need firewood in an emergency, you can ask me. I might say yes if you ask nicely instead of demanding it." He chuckled. Fair enough. The anniversary of the bonfire became something of a legend in Pine Ridge Estates. People would reference it when discussing HOA overreach or property rights. "Remember when Victor burned all his firewood?" became shorthand for standing up against unreasonable demands. Some people thought I'd been petty. They weren't wrong. It was absolutely a petty response to burn everything rather than let anyone else benefit from it. But it was also a principled stand. I'd worked for that wood. It was mine. And when faced with the choice of surrendering to extortion or destroying it, I chose the option that preserved my autonomy and property rights. The legal precedent was interesting too. Tom Patterson told me that my case, along with the subsequent investigation into Brenda's misconduct, had caught the attention of Colorado state legislators. There was talk of introducing new laws to prevent HOA overreach and provide clearer protections for homeowner property rights. "Your bonfire might end up changing HOA law statewide," Tom said over drinks one evening about a year after everything went down. "All I wanted was to keep my firewood," I laughed. Sometimes the smallest things spark the biggest changes. 2 years after the bonfire, Pine Ridge Estates had become one of the most sought-after HOA communities in the Boulder area, not despite the turmoil, but because of it. The story of residents standing up to an abusive board and implementing real reform attracted buyers who wanted to live somewhere with a functional, reasonable HOA. Property values increased by 12% over those 2 years, outpacing neighboring developments. Frank joked that my bonfire had been the best thing that ever happened to everyone's home equity. I never did find out what happened to Brenda after her sentencing. I heard through the neighborhood rumor mill that she'd moved to Denver, away from the area where everyone knew about her crimes. Part of me felt bad for her. She'd let power go to her head and made increasingly poor decisions until she destroyed her own reputation and ended up with a criminal record. But mostly, I felt satisfied that justice had been served. She'd tried to steal from me, harassed me, defamed me, and embezzled from the community. She'd faced consequences for all of it. As for the firewood, I kept gathering it every year. My locked shed stood in my backyard, filled each fall with neatly stacked cords of seasoned wood. I'd fire up the fireplace on cold winter nights, enjoying the heat and the crackling flames, remembering that sometimes you have to destroy something valuable to prove a point worth making. The whole experience taught me lessons about property rights, community dynamics, and the importance of standing up to bullies even when it costs you something. It taught me that sometimes the most dramatic response is the right response, that going nuclear when pushed into a corner can actually solve the problem rather than make it worse. Would I do it again? Absolutely. In fact, several people from other HOA communities around Boulder have reached out to me over the years, telling me about their own battles with overreaching boards. I always tell them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, get a good lawyer, and don't be afraid to make a statement when necessary. One guy in Louisville was facing a similar situation where his HOA was trying to force him to remove a vegetable garden from his backyard, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. I advised him to fight it, connected him with Tom Patterson, and followed the case. He won. The board backed down, and no vegetables were harmed in the making of that victory. Life in Pine Ridge Estates settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA handled actual community needs like snow removal, landscaping of common areas, and organizing neighborhood events. They enforced reasonable rules fairly and transparently. Frank served 2 terms as president before stepping down to let someone else take over. The reform-minded culture he'd established continued. I even served on the board myself for 1 term, feeling obligated to give back after everything that had happened. It was tedious work, mostly dealing with minor maintenance issues and reviewing the budget, but it felt good to be part of keeping the community functional and reasonable. The fireplace in my home remained one of my favorite features. On particularly cold nights, I'd sit in front of it with a book and a drink, watching the wood I'd gathered and processed burn slowly and efficiently. Each log represented a small piece of the labor I'd put in, and using them on my own terms felt satisfying in a way that's hard to explain. My girlfriend Nicole, who I'd started dating about a year after the bonfire incident, loved the fireplace too. She'd heard the whole story before we got serious, and her reaction had been one of amused respect. "You actually burned it all, the entire supply?" she'd asked the first time I told her. "Every last piece. Took a whole weekend. That's the most spitefully beautiful thing I've ever heard." Nicole got along great with the neighbors, and she integrated into the Pine Ridge community seamlessly. She even helped organize a neighborhood bonfire night the following summer, a sanctioned community event where everyone brought wood to contribute to a shared celebration fire. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 2 years earlier, Brenda had tried to force me to share my wood, and I'd burned it all. Now here we were, voluntarily contributing to a community fire because it was actually a fun, freely chosen activity rather than a mandated redistribution of personal property. "It's all about consent and choice," I explained to Nicole. If Brenda had just asked nicely, had explained that some neighbors were struggling and wondered if anyone had extra wood to share, I might have given some away. But the moment she demanded it and threatened fines, it became about principle. 3 years after the bonfire, I was sitting in my backyard on a fall evening when Frank stopped by. "You hear the news?" he asked, settling into one of my patio chairs. "What news?" "Brenda's probation ended last month. She's apparently trying to move back to the area, bought a condo in Lafayette." I felt a small knot of tension form in my stomach. Is she going to be a problem? Doubt it. She can't serve on any HOA board, remember. And everyone around here knows what happened. She'd be crazy to start anything. Frank was right. Brenda moved back to the area but kept a low profile. I saw her once at a grocery store in Boulder. She saw me too, and for a moment we made eye contact across the produce section. Then she quickly turned and walked away. No confrontation, no drama, just avoidance. It was probably better that way. Life continued its forward momentum. I got promoted at work, which came with a nice raise and the ability to work remotely more often. Nicole and I got engaged, and we started planning a wedding for the following summer. She wanted to have it in a mountain venue up near Estes Park, which seemed fitting given that's where my Firewood saga had originated with my cousin's property. The HOA even offered to help organize a neighborhood celebration after the wedding, which was a far cry from the hostile environment that had existed under Brenda's leadership. We accepted, touched by the genuine community spirit that had emerged in Pine Ridge Estates. 4 years after the bonfire, Colorado passed new HOA legislation that directly addressed property rights and board oversight. The law explicitly prohibited HOAs from declaring personal property as community resources without compensation at fair market value. It also implemented stronger financial oversight requirements and gave homeowners more tools to challenge unreasonable fines. Tom Patterson sent me a copy of the bill with a note. "Your bonfire echoes in state law. You made a difference." It felt surreal to think that my personal battle over firewood had contributed to actual legal reform that would protect homeowners across the entire state. Change sometimes comes from the most unexpected places and the most stubborn stands. The wedding was beautiful. We got married in September with the aspens turning gold in the mountains. My cousin, whose property had provided the wood that started everything, was a groomsman. Frank gave a toast at the reception that referenced the whole incident, getting huge laughs from everyone who knew the story. To Victor, who taught us all that sometimes the best way to fight for your rights is to burn everything to the ground and start fresh. May your marriage be less dramatic and more warming than that bonfire. Everyone raised their glasses, and Nicole kissed me amid laughter and applause. We bought a new house together the following spring, staying in Pine Ridge Estates, but moving to a larger property with more land. The new place had an even better fireplace and room for an even bigger wood shed. I was already planning my firewood operations for the next winter. Some people never learn, but I'd learned exactly the right lessons. Stand up for yourself. Don't let bullies push you around. Document everything. Get good legal help. And sometimes, when pushed to the breaking point, the most dramatic response sends the clearest message. My wood shed on the new property was magnificent. A custom-built structure with proper ventilation, a solid roof, and yes, a good lock on the door. Not because I expected anyone to try stealing my wood again, but because some precautions are just common sense. The first load of logs from my cousin's latest tree removal project looked beautiful stacked in that new shed. I spent a peaceful Saturday afternoon splitting wood by hand, feeling the familiar burn in my shoulders and arms, enjoying the simple satisfaction of physical labor producing visible results. Nicole brought me water and sat on a nearby stump, watching me work. "You really love this, don't you?" "I do. There's something honest about it. You put in the work, you get the results. No politics, no bureaucracy, just effort and physics. And if another crazy HOA president tries to take it, then I've got about 8 cords of bonfire fuel ready to go." She laughed, and the sound echoed across our new property, mixing with the thunk of the maul splitting another log. 5 years after the bonfire, I was interviewed for a podcast about HOA reform. The host had heard my story and wanted to discuss property rights, community governance, and standing up to abuse of power. The episode got thousands of downloads and sparked renewed discussion about HOA reform in states beyond Colorado. People from across the country reached out to share their own HOA horror stories. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to vent. I tried to help where I could, connecting people with resources and encouraging them to document everything and fight back when appropriate. The bonfire had become something larger than just my personal act of defiance. It had become a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny and overreach. That wasn't what I'd intended when I lit that first match, but I couldn't deny feeling proud that my stand had resonated with so many people. Winter arrived in its annual rush of cold and snow. I fired up my fireplace in the new house for the first time, using wood from my properly secured and legally indisputable supply. The heat spread through our home, and Nicole curled up next to me on the couch with a blanket and hot chocolate. "Best heating system ever," she murmured. "Better than natural gas, so much better. It's got character and history. Expensive history. Worth every penny and every fine and every hour in court." She was right. The whole experience, as frustrating and stressful as it had been, had been worth it. I'd stood up for my rights. I'd helped reform a broken system. I'd found a community of people who valued fairness and reason. And I'd learned that sometimes you have to burn it all down to build something better. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Each log that burned represented not just heat for my home, but a reminder of the battle I'd won and the principles I'd defended. My firewood, gathered by my labor, burned for my benefit, on my terms, in my fireplace. That's all I'd ever wanted. And in the end, despite the drama and the lawsuits and the criminal charges and the complete upheaval of neighborhood politics, I got exactly that. The flames danced in the fireplace, warm and bright and mine. Nobody could fine me for having them. Nobody could demand I share them. Nobody could tell me they belonged to the community or that keeping them for myself was selfish. They were mine because I'd made them mine through effort and principle, and one spectacularly petty bonfire that changed everything. And sitting there in my warm home with my wife beside me, watching wood I'd honestly earned burn for my benefit, I couldn't imagine a better ending to the story.